Welcome to the Fixed and Prep podcast, where we dive deep into the process of film and television production design, brought to you by the Canadian Production Design Association. Joining us today is Oscar-winning production designer Paul Austerberry. Paul is a Toronto-based production designer, best known for winning the Academy Award and BAFTA for Best Production Design on the film The Shape of Water, directed by Guillermo del Toro. Paul has designed extensively for feature film, with credits including It Chapter 2, The Christmas Chronicles, 30 Days of Night, Pompeii, The Liberator, Deadfall, The Three Musketeers, The Twilight Saga, Eclipse, and Death Race. His most recent work was on DC Comics' The Flash, as well as the musical remake of Steven Spielberg's The Color Purple, which we're here to talk about today. Hi, Paul. Thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And thank you again for doing our keynote address for Production Design Week. It was so insightful to get a look into your career and your thought process.
It was fun to do. It was good to look back at all this stuff, actually. Hadn't looked at a lot of those images in a long time.
So let's talk about The Color Purple, which came out in December. So how did you get involved on the project?
Actually, I was working in England on The Flash, and I think about 6 months prior, so that must have been May or something like that of 2021, I think that was. I got a call. Dan Lauston and I both got a call, actually, from Blitz Bazwoli, the director. He had spoken to Dan first. He really liked The Shape of Water, and so he was, at the very beginning, he really wanted to see if he could get Dan and the same and myself on. So he got to hold of Dan and myself, and within Dan and I talked to each other, and we were both interested in the script, and neither of us had done a musical before, so we were quite intrigued by the idea. The timing worked out pretty well, almost too well. I'd been in England for a year, and then they wanted me to go almost from England straight to Atlanta to start. So I said no. I had to come home for at least 2 weeks and regroup. And I started in the very beginning of November in 2021.
From my understanding, Blitz is from a music background. What was that like collaborating with him? And how much of this, I guess, did you have conceptualized or like figured out, or maybe a point of view or perspective before, like in the interview, or like going into it?
I hadn't read the book in a long time, so I reread the book before my interview with Blitz, and I didn't watch the film again, but I had seen, obviously, the Spielberg film. I didn't want to influence, I want to listen to what Blitz had to say about it, because obviously this is a musical. It was not a serious drama like the original film. So I wanted to understand what the locations were and everything. I knew what the environment should be in my mind, but I didn't know what Blitz had in his mind, because he's a musician first. He became a filmmaker later. This is his first big feature film. He'd done a small film which I had watched that he shot in Ghana. He's a native of Ghana, that he funded himself, and it was quite visually interesting. It was a low budget movie shot on location, but visuals that I thought were intriguing just for that particular story. And then when I spoke to him, and the basic premise for him was, instead of like the original movie, when they went to real places, and when they went to Africa for the stories with his sister, or Ceely's sister in Africa, they actually went, or second unit at least, went to Africa and shot pieces. He didn't really want to do any of that. He wanted to explore the world through Ceely's imagination. She came from a small little environment and town, but she had imagination, and she escaped her traumas through her imagination. But he started with talking about the music. Like I said, he was a musician first, and the movie spans many decades and many different musical genres. And he'd been working for 3 months with musicians in LA in the studio, or reworking some of the Broadway musical numbers and some new numbers as well in the various styles. Broadway has I'm not a Broadway expert, but Broadway has a certain style. He wanted to have certain songs that were going to be musical numbers, but he wanted them to be able to be listened to straight on the radio. If you heard it on the radio, you'd think it was a real blues track from turn of the century, or the 20s or 30s. He wanted that kind of authenticity. So that's where we started. And then he had actually he lived in Atlanta, so he'd traveled around a certain amount just to get the vibe of the towns and things that were available. So he'd sent me a few key things that he liked, and other than that, it was just basically research and pounding the pavements, or pounding the miles in the car. We did a lot of driving around rural Georgia with John LaTenzer, the location manager. I think I spent 5 weeks with him. We drove Savannah, Jekyll Island. We drove all over, up and down the coast, and then mainly like within an hour and a half or 2 hours of Atlanta. So that was basically how I started with it.
How did you go about building your team on this?
So it was one of these odd times where you're hired that far in advance that I could start looking into crew really early. And my supervising art director in England on The Flash, he had just prior to working with me on The Flash, he was working on a film, Red Notice, and they were supposed to shoot it in Europe. And then they had, because of COVID, they brought it all back to the States and to Atlanta. And because he was British based, he couldn't work in Atlanta. So he ended up having to replace himself or find, and him and the designer had to find another art director, supervising art director in Atlanta. And they had settled on an Irishman based in LA, I should say, but part of the union in the States, Rory Bruin. And so he said, well, you might want to try him because he has a crew. He's been in Atlanta. They'd kind of finished Red Notice and he was taking a break. And as it turned out, he was visiting London. And so I made arrangements to meet him in person. He was on his way to get married. He was like, timing was perfect. He said, we can get married and know we're going to have a job afterwards. So I actually organized him quite early. And it was obviously through, as it is when you go to these distant locations, you have to really rely on your people who know the local crew. I said to hire the rest of them once you hire the key. Larry Diaz, our set decorator, of course, I'd worked with for about 5 weeks in LA on a Sherlock Holmes 3 before it fell apart a couple years prior. And he also works in Atlanta a lot. He also had wanted some time off, and so I was able to book him in advance, and he was happy to have a job booked so he could go to Portugal and have a holiday first. So it was really nice for once not to have to rush hiring crew. So I was very fortunate to have a really good crew that way.
The lighting and cinematography in the film is obviously pretty incredible, and you had worked with Dan before. How do you guys collaborate? Was it easier, I suppose, because you've worked with him before on such a great film?
It was great having Dan involved. Dan and I are good friends as well, so it was very nice to collaborate together. We spend a fair bit of time when we're working on a job, especially on a location job. You don't have a lot of local people to have dinner with, so you often have a dinner with your coworkers. And so Dan and I spent a lot of time together from the beginning. So we could get to talk a lot about the sets as we went, or the locations as we went. And Blitz didn't live very far from us either, so he would have us over for dinner and we'd watch movies and talk about things. So it was quite a nice collaboration and a very friendly collab between the three of us. And Dan is a master of lighting, and he's very specific about what he wants to do. So early on, we talk about where he wants to put, if it's a stage set, we talk about how we're going to light it, how we're going to shoot it. We walk around virtually in either a little virtual in a computer, or we do little maquettes, cardboard maquettes, and just talk about angles and things. The nice thing about this particular film was, we had not a ridiculous number of locations, so we were able to, concentrate and spend time planning them out. There was a lot of logistical issues about it, but the spaces are quite small, potentially not the easiest to shoot or light. So it was quite important that we talked about them at length early on, just to make sure that during the shoot they were relatively easy to, well, it wasn't that easy in a lot of those locations, especially out in the middle of water, for instance, but we were able to plan out our shots in advance.
You mentioned it was your first musical, right?
Yes, and Dan and I's first musical, exactly.
So what was that like, getting used to? I'm assuming, but I don't know, that it has a slightly different, I guess, process. I mean, in terms of like making sure that everyone was rehearsing on the sets early.
Actually, I was a bit terrified of the musical. Getting ready for the musical because my friend Gord Sim has done a number of musicals with Rob Marshall. And Rob Marshall's a choreographer first, I think, before a movie maker. So, that's his main focus to start with, I imagine. And I heard, from Gord that they had to have the sets done really early. They had to have all the exact props, not stand-in props or anything. They had to have the real props and the real furniture for them to rehearse, just to get everything so precise. And so I was quite worried because we didn't, we had a reasonable amount of time, but some of the locations were a long way away. And, if we're going to try to do these things, we couldn't really do them on location. Things like that wasn't all a stage it wasn't all stage builds like a lot of those Rob Marshall dance numbers. And so I was quite concerned about that. But as it turned out, Fatima Robinson, our choreographer, wasn't like that. Like her way of working wasn't as strict, I guess, as that. And so really what we did was we taped things out on the floor in their dance studio, and we provide them substitute furnishings and stand-in tables and whatever. And they were quite flexible, and which was really nice. And once they would rehearse, we'd show them the kind of the drawings and the models of the places we're going to be. Once they would come onto the set, they would react if Larry had brought in different pieces of furniture that we didn't put every little piece in the models or whatever. They'd come and rehearse, and that Fatima had an idea of where the angle was going to be for a lot of it, but sometimes it didn't work for the best for lighting, So when Dan came, he's like, "Oh, geez, can we just flip it 180 in the set?" Because the window's there and whatnot. And obviously we're seeing 360 and all of these things, but some of the main axes and angles we want to see, he wanted to have the best opportunities for lighting. And surprisingly, they said, "Yeah, sure." And they would just rework it, and all the dancers were so pro about it. They would just adapt on the fly and completely flip it 180, the day before on a rehearsal on set, I should say, or a couple of days before. And yeah, it was interesting. Originally, we were going to shoot on this covered bridge that had, it was an 1840s covered bridge or something like that had really irregular, big old planks on the ground. And I thought, oh no, we're going to have to like fill in all these holes and make it even. And the team and the assistant choreographers came, no, we're fine. We're fine. I mean, as long as there's no nails sticking up and big, huge tripping hazards or ankle breaking hazards, they were fine with like slightly irregular things, and that came to the fore when we were doing the juke joint. The juke joint is very tight, rickety looking, built out of old, salvaged, worn, curved, warped wood. And the floors, there was all rough sawn sarking kind of floors that, once we aged them all up, they cupped, and some were concave, some were convex. And, I was a bit nervous about all of that. And they said, nah, that's fine. And Larry found all these sort of found objects, salvaged furnishings. They were kind of rickety, so we wanted to keep them looking like that, but we had to reinforce them all with a lot of metal brackets and things like that to make them secure, even though they looked rather rickety. And as long as there was no splinters, everyone was happy. I think those older musicals with huge stage numbers and lots of room and everything to choreograph and shoot around. And our particular film, the juke joint was little, and we shot part of the dance number actually on location, surrounded by water, and then the majority of it actually on set. But that location couldn't be a massive location. It should feel like a small, contained juke joint, like quite intimate, and the dance number was designed around that. So it's tricky to shoot and plan for the shoot, but I think it worked. The last dance number in Seeley's Pants in the general store was also quite a confined one. That was, at first you'd think it's just a rectangular box. There wasn't a lot of opportunities, but I designed in levels that we could have, and it had to have this iteration. It went from 1905 general store to 1940s again, and again it turned over into around 47 or whatever it was when it became Miss Seeley's Pants. We had to plan early on elements that would help work for the dance at the very end. We had this upper level of, I made it really tall so we could have an upper level, and then the upper level in the earlier iterations was just extra storage for the hardware store. But we knew that we could have, these walls could be on hinges that kick open for an upper level of dancers. And of course, very easily you could run across up and down the counters. I just researched about dancing and talking to the choreographers about what they liked. I mean, that's really how it came. And I'd happily do another one. It was fun. We did have at least one of the big classical, 1940s kind of 30s kind of dance number, which was the sort of the duet between our Seeley and Sugar Avery when they come down. It's sort of an Art Deco platform. They come down around and they sing to each other and dance. I mean, that's more of your typical old school musical. And it was nice to be able to do that in her imagination, to expand into that kind of classic look as well.
Research. I mean, I imagine there was an extensive research process with this. And what was that research process like?
Because Blitz wanted to go into the imagination, Celia's imagination, have these sort of bit of magical realism in various times during the film. I think what we all felt together that the most important thing was then to ground it all in pretty accurate research. So we, as every movie, historical or not, research or looking into whatever the story's about, gathering as much visual information and written information as possible is very, very important. So, I did a bunch of research before I finished on The Flash. And then, of course, I had, a researcher for a while going in Atlanta, and Larry also had a bunch of research done, and we compiled it all together, and, books, photographs, we compiled it all together, and we could look at it all and discuss, the important things with Blitz and Larry, of course. And then once we're pretty grounded in that, then I think you were more free the leeway in this particular film came with, how we tackled the imaginations or the dance numbers and things like that, because obviously, there was times where probably we shouldn't have as much electricity as we did, and we needed to have a little bit of it because very hard to light only with, flames, oil lamps and whatnot. But we did early on, it was whether or not there were LEDs tricked out to look like flames in reworked oil lanterns and things like that. We did start that way, but in my research in some of these little houses in rural Georgia, might have had a single light bulb in there well into the 30s. It would be pretty raw. So we had to take some license in those things. But essentially, like most period movies, the research is the backbone of where we start.
The color story is really thoughtful. It's beautifully done. And I was wondering if you could speak to the color story that you created for the film.
Generally speaking, the one thing Blitz did say at the beginning was he didn't want it to be completely sort of ochres and earth tones and drab and dusty the whole film. He wanted to have a little more color than that. But we decided that the important, we could start out mostly like that, kind of quite muted, earthy colors to start with in most of the palettes. When we get into, Celia moves from the life story of hers. She starts in this hardware store, this little dusty town, which is all that palette like I discussed. And we move into, she ends up having to transition into Mr.'s house. And we kept that actually everything else was a bit warmer. We kept his house a little cooler, but still fairly neutral. There was like pale blues and blue grays and green grays in there. Not much pattern at all. And that's tracking her evolution. And then when Shug Avery comes to town, and that's literally the name of one of the songs, this introduces the sort of rich colors of burgundies and deep reds. She arrives in a deep red car the very first time she comes to town. When we actually end up in Shug Avery's room, it's the only room in the house that we've never been to before. And we decided it's a bit of a shrine to Shug Avery. It's the ex-lover of Mr., and he just adores her, and he keeps a room because she does visit every now and then, and he keeps a room full of her stuff. And when we actually do go into her room, we see that it's got a bit of pattern, it's got some texture, and it's got pinks and burgundies and reds in there. It's completely different feeling, much more, and it's much more busy than the rest of the house. The other part of the house is quite sparse, but it brings in that warmer tone, and the color is bringing strength. So Shug Avery is a very strong, powerful character. She comes in, she literally applies red lipstick onto Celia when she dresses her up the first time. The first time we see her gaining confidence and stepping out dressed up in a really nice dress, and then being brought out to the juke joint that night. So literally she's literally putting that red color, transferring that red color. And then right after that, Celia is now inside this juke joint, which is again muted browns and worn grays and everything, except for most of the colors of the patrons are getting a little more color because there's a little more life there, but they're still quite in those warm tones. And then we have this sort of Danlit, this sort of very stylized moonlight scene. It almost feels like a stage set out there, that big musical number when she comes in on the boat through the fog. It's like as if we had a massive big stage. And then she arrives in this incredibly deep red dress and a beautiful red feathered headdress. And so she really stands out in that color, and again, especially against the sort of blue moonlight, it really stood out. And then she and that energy pump comes into the juke joint, and the juke joint just blows up and becomes alive. And then from that point, any strong female character, there's this little bit more of that warmth color comes into the costumes. When Celia escapes her trappings at Mrs., she goes to Shug Avery's Memphis house. And here we get into this. It was a beautiful house, turn of the century house in Inman Park in Atlanta that we decorated. And there was a big musical number in there that was in quite a deep red. And then eventually, when Celia inherits the general store, goes back and creates her own business. She's now a strong character. She takes that color and she repaints that green, the green earthy colors of that particular store with this. It's like a really deep dusty rose. So she's bringing that warmth back in, and then she struts out when it's in the song Miss Celie's Pants, and she rips off what she's wearing. She's wearing vibrant red pants. So that's how. So the color moves along with the story and her gaining her own inner strength, sort of symbolic of that.
And one other thing that I thought was really great was obviously Larry's work. Felt really authentic and layered, sometimes hard to do, I think, with period work, sometimes to get the amount of layers needed that still feels authentic. Was there any particular way you worked with Larry?
Larry's got a lot of experience. He was great. He has a lot of good connections in LA at the rental houses. So he went in and shopped in LA and booked a whole ton of things. He just did a broad pull, did a huge pull, and booked it for the whole run of the show. So we'd have, trucks and trucks and trucks came here, and we had enough space that we could lay it all out in our warehouse and have it all. It was basically like having a prop shop on our own. And of course, he wouldn't leave many stones unturned in the rural South. There's a lot of antique places and stuff like that. So they would drive like 5 hours to some little town where they're having some flea market or something and get a bunch of things early on. I was amazed because I always thought, oh, geez, we're gonna have to build all the counters in the general store. So we'd pulled out pictures, and I started thinking about drawing. I said, no, I think I can probably find those. And he ended up finding a bunch. The wood colors might have been a bit different. So he would gather the different ones and we got them from, the East Coast. We got them from all over, shipped in, and then the Scenics would strip them, or he would have them refinished in a certain way so they all matched, and so they would look a lot more like they were purpose built for that particular store. So that was amazing. And then lighting is always so key, and layers. The layers. He just had a lot of stuff. He had a really great team, and he's got a really good eye, and just had so much stuff on hand. So we would dress a set, then we can go into his storage, and just literally everything was organized in there like a prop shop, and we just hunt down and pull out different things. And so we had lots of opportunities to change things up on the day if we needed to. There were doubles of lots of things if Blitz or Dan didn't quite like the specific thing, because like I said, if it's fairly minimally dressed at times, you want to have the piece has to be pretty key. Then you get to things like the general store, which was, at least in the 1905 or 1909 version, the beginning, it's very full, it's full of stuff. And, it's a long time ago, it's 120 years ago, or 15 years ago. And we had to make a lot of, the graphics for a lot of those things had to be made. He also had to find, you could find one thing that was like really good mint condition at a flea market or something like that, an antique store, but then you needed 10 the same. That's kind of a tricky thing. So sometimes you had to mold them and make them look like the same product. We'd find like one or two packaging boxes or tins that look good, so we have to recreate the graphics and then buy tins and make them all again, so you have multiples. It's just like doing a grocery store from the 50s and stuff. It all has to be manufactured, but it's just harder when you go that far back to get packaged stuff you can make, but it's other things that you got to buy all these rooms that all have to look the same, or and some things you can go to these kind of legacy stores that have these old style hardware stores, things that the design of the little tin bucket is the same as the little design of the tin bucket from 100 years ago. So those kind of things you're able to get, but it was all those little layers that really made it come to life. And there's various prop houses, and there's one guy who's a collector of vintage signs, and we used a lot of his signs. So once we cleared them, we'd have to make them all, a lot of those enameled tin signs, and they'd all come beautifully sleeved, and they have a sticker on them telling what date they were from and whatnot. So it's quite handy to have. We did create a number of our own as well, especially around the gas station, but it was nice to have those things. And Larry had a great team and really layered it up was good. It was because it was quite a busy schedule for them as well.
So Larry has spoken about he brought in pieces so early that he was putting them into the concept.
Once we found the exterior of the house, then I was able to fairly early on design the interior, because it was, like I said, it was a pretty pivotal location that we were at a lot. But to sell it all, you know, it's one thing when you're doing these early concepts to just put in furnishings that you think might be found. But we were lucky enough that Larry had, when he'd done a lot of these pulls early and found some key pieces, we only had a few key pieces in some of these rooms. So he would pull a selection, we'd choose them. And then Dara was illustrating that particular house. We would send her into the shop, or to the workshop, I should say, to photograph and measure, and then she would model it and put it in Blender and stick it inside her Blender model. So then we could really look at how it fit. And so when Blitz, again, it was nice for Blitz to come in. He hadn't done a lot of films before, so he'd come in, see the rendering, and see all these pieces. And for the most part, when he walked on set, it looked very much like the mood of what that illustration was. I mean, they weren't photorealistic illustrations. They were quite, a little bit more painterly, which is I prefer actually for this kind of thing, because it just gives a little more. People don't get locked into exactly what they see. If they see a very photorealistic rendering, sometimes, and they walk in, it's not quite the same. They're like, wait a minute, what was that? You drew that thing was in the illustration. It's not here. Well, it's kind of nice to be able to, if you can, have it as close to what you're going to get as possible. And so it just made everyone feel more comfortable with just arriving on set. We're quite fortunate to have that's a rare treat to be able to do that with a whole set. Every room in that house, her bedroom, we measured everything and put it in the illustrations, because we had it was a set that was designed quite early and it was shot a little bit later, so we were able to do that.
Yeah, no, it seemed like a luxury, like a good luxury.
Oh, it was definitely a luxury.
Yeah.
Depending on the scale of film, often you don't have a lot of illustration time, but I had two quite junior illustrators on staff that were in-house, didn't have to ship them out to anyone. And it's a location-based film. So I'd take pictures for the angle I wanted to sell the location in. And I knew, around the tree, for instance, I'd take a nice, beautiful picture, and then I had all the tables would have, it would be an illustrated Blender, and the shadows could be blended to match. And strangely enough, when I was putting my pictures together, sometimes for the ADG, for instance, if there's pictures quite small, I couldn't tell which one was illustration and which one was the final picture. Because I tried then later on, if I had the opportunity, I would take a picture from the same angle that I took the picture to do the illustration when it was fully dressed. And it's quite a nice thing to see the before and after, or the illustration and the final result. So I tend, especially on a location-based kind of movie like this one, we're salesmen. We got to sell the idea to the director and the producer and the DP and everyone about what our ideas are, and what best way to do it is frame up the angle that you want to help sell it with. And then if you have the opportunity, or if you have your own, I couldn't draw them myself, but I mean, if you have someone who are able to do the illustrations for you, you can give them the ideas and paint right over the illustration. It's a really useful way to do it. So.
Saying that Larry, and the set tech team had a tight schedule, but and part of that made me think the turnarounds must have been a lot, because you're transitioning between all these spaces, and not just set tech, but I mean, I'm assuming construction and paint as well. So what were the turnarounds like for the two main sets that had to transition?
The set that needed the most turnaround was the juke joint. I mean, the juke joint, first of all, was a difficult one to figure out how we should approach it anyway. It's written as it's this old shack that's built in a swamp that he inherits. We went to Savannah, and around near Savannah, we went to some amazing swamps that were stunningly beautiful. The water levels go up and down at will of the nature. You can't control them. And we thought about building there. We found a really great location to build on, part of a dock that stuck out into some water, and then we're going to extend it. But the reality of the story was, it starts off, we needed to go there at 3 different time periods, and the architecture had to change for those 3 different times. We start off with this rundown shack, a skeleton of an old boathouse kind of thing that's in the swamp, and then that he inherited. And then, of course, he scavenges a bunch of wood and he builds a house for him and his young family to start with. And then that falls apart tragically or drastically anyways. And then he decides he's going to make a juke joint out there. So he builds onto it, makes it, and we have to make it big enough to do a dance number in it. So 3 stages all over water, and at a distant location in Savannah, like 3.5 hours, whatever, 4 hours from our base. And we had to go back 3 different times. And we were only budgeted really to go to the coast for it's like 2.5 weeks at a cluster at the very beginning of our schedule, before the tourist season and all the rest. So that quickly fell apart, and we realized that, you know, the water, we couldn't guarantee where the water was going to be. It could be really high one time and really low the next time, depending on, we could be flooded. You know, it wasn't a great thing to try to be practical. So John Latenza, our location manager, found another opportunity. He found an old plantation near Covington, Georgia, which is like an hour from central Atlanta. There was a bit of terrain, and they turned this plantation into a hunting fishing like lodge. So they dammed several lakes, and so we scouted all the 3 little. I don't know, I'm talking, when I say lakes, they're more like little ponds, right? So they dammed three different spots, and they each of them had their charm. Eventually, we selected one, and then from some aerial photography, we could plot out all the trees and whatnot, and I mapped out where I thought the best place would be. I designed the thing already in 3D, so we plunked it in the middle. So we drained it about, I guess, 5 feet or something like that, 6 feet, so that it became a muddy bottom where we needed to be. And it was tricky, you know, they put fiberglass swamp mats down, and they drove little machinery out and pounded all the piles in. I wanted to keep as many trees around it as possible because that's what gave it the character. And then we built the biggest set first. We decided we were going to go with the biggest construction, which was the final part in the film, which was the juke joint. And then we let the water fill back in. It took about 3 or 4 weeks to let it fill back up. And the last week, we knew we could pump water from the lake below into it just to get the last 6 inches we needed. So we did that to get it done in time. And of course, we shot it with barges and big long cranes from the shore. But then, of course, the crew went away for 2 weeks. We had to then take it apart and remove a whole chunk of it, and build the middle stage, which was the house. And then we did that from barges and from the dock itself, because the dock was fairly big. So we were able to work from the inside and remove, and we planned it so we could remove a lot of it and keep some of it underneath. The bones of the house were there underneath anyway. The next time was a bit shorter. We went away only for a week, and we had to come back and strip it back down again to the river shack, where I think the song's called Workin', you know, when he's building him as his buddies are building the place in the first place. So it was quite a logistical thing to plan that all out. And again, for the shooting crew, it was a pain to shoot because we're there at night a lot. Big lights, you know, they had to cut a little road in for Dan's construction cranes to get into to put the big moonlights from 2 different sides. But I don't think, and in the end, I think, thank God we didn't try to do that at the coast. You know, it was far better choice for us to do it there. But the timing was quite tight between it, you know, logistically. I mean, the set dressing, you know, think about it, when we were in the house, or that house in particular, you know, we had a bunch of scenes in there. We even had a dance. They had a dance number in that as well, all shot by barge, or all shot by 50-foot techno crane from the shore. And every time we had to wild something or move furniture, it all had to be lugged down that one little boardwalk out to the shore. So the set decoration team had to lug it in and out of that thing every time. It was quite a thing, but it really worked because it was such an indoor-outdoor connection that there was no way we could do it in the studio, except for the final dance in the juke joint. So we did replicate that inside and built it slightly, 15% bigger, and then do a sort of foreshortened faux vista out the end of the stage out into the swamp. And Dan lit it to look with fog and a little bit of reflective plastic on the ground, and some foreshortened little dead trees and smaller lights. We did scaled versions of the lights to make it look like, there's a perspective out there. When Sugar arrives on that barge, it's beautiful looking out that way. We're looking that hero angle towards the moonlight. She arrives on the edge of the dock. She struts in. VFX kind of freaked out at first because I said I don't want to have the doors closed behind her. Like there was like this big barn door slid open, and they slid open. They were open, and she comes in on the stage. I set the stage up on there, so the background behind her, anytime she was on the stage, was this beautiful vista of the moonlight and the water and the reflections in the background. That's much better than being in this tiny little wooden shack the whole time. So you always want to open it out a little bit at one side, not to contain it so much. But of course, that meant that when we went on stage, we could have just done a blue screen out there, and they could have shot plates, and we had to do a comp every single shot looking that way. But so they freaked out a little bit about having to do that. But I said, well, I think we can do it because of the fog, because of the moonlight. We can do a foreshortened perspective. You know, it goes a bit soft anyway back there, so we were able to set it up that way, and it worked out really, really well in the end. I think the transition is fairly seamless. I mean, I look and I can see that I know which shots are on location, because we did shoot some. We did bring her on. So there's, you know, you cut back and forth sometimes from location to the stage set, and it's I can see the difference, but I don't think, because I know exactly what I'm looking for, but I don't think a lot of people can. So that's quite good. It was much more interesting than just closing the doors and having her just up against a tin wall to start with.
Yeah, I couldn't tell how much back and forth you guys did between studio and the actual set. So
we had to, I mean, they're able to shoot some of it on the location, and then obviously when the Harpo flips the switch down, and it goes into the sort of raunchy night dance version of the dance. And it's very stagey. It's very like Broadway, with the lights beaming through from the upper deck and everything. That obviously had to be on stage, I should say, to allow for the lighting. You know, we couldn't do that definitely couldn't do that on the water. They would have killed me if I tried to make them do that.
how big was that roughly? Like, I mean, the built like on the dock.
It wasn't that big. It was probably like 35 feet long by 20 feet wide. It was pretty small, actually. And, you know,
Yeah.
we've been about 15% bigger on stage, but it was pretty small. I mean, it shouldn't be too big, right? We want to keep it that way, keep it intimate in there.
Well, I guess, can you also talk about the transition of the general store? Because that goes through what, three or four?
Yeah, we have three iterations of the general store. That one wasn't too bad schedule wise. Basically, we started in 1908, and it's a pretty full general store. And that the girls live upstairs at the time before City moves out, and that was shot. That was a stage build, plus we had an exterior on our location, in a place called Grantville, which is kind of this little main street of a small town that had kind of died. The main street died because the freeway went by. The highway went through town, obviously, originally, and then when the freeway was built, it skirted by like a couple miles away. So the main street, you know, and there's a strip mall ended up out there or something. So the main street kind of died. There's maybe, you know, I can't remember how many stores, but about 30% of the stores were occupied, and which is great for us because it was a back lot, basically. We looked at it like a back lot. So we chose an exterior of the great general store there. So we established the windows basically from that. And then we built the stage set, 2-story set, well, ground floor and a separate apartment above store, separately. And then we, you know, that turned later on. The next time we see it, it's in the 40s, and it's kind of in disarray. It's got a lot less product, but the product's all more modern products. If you looked at the products that were there, they were actually Larry changed a lot of the products to be into the 30 years later, 35 years later. And then after that was a bit of a rush. We had to strip that out and then repaint it and refurb it as a Miss Seeley's Pants. Now, of course, we had time to have all that dressing ready, and it was really just a quick turnaround for paint and not much else, because we just stripped out a lot of things that were in the hardware store and kept a lot of things. And that was that. That one wasn't too bad. The trickier part was the exterior of that particular town, because we had to turn over again. We had the same, you know, there's dirt all over the roads, because there would have been dirt roads essentially the whole time, and we didn't quite have enough money to put wooden planks over the sidewalks. We just kind of put dirt on the sidewalks, but it probably should have been, you know, the research would have told us it was mostly wooden planks on sidewalks, I guess, outside the stores. But we only had a day and a half to clean all that up and change all the signage and change the decor from one time period to the next. So that was a big deal. And it was just so dusty, with the street sweepers, you know, sweeping it all up. Everything just covered in dust. The cleanup just alone after they got rid of the dust was one of the biggest things. They did that kind of all afternoon and overnight, got rid of the dust, and then we had a whole day basically to change everything. It was a bit of a pain, but most of the signage and stuff didn't really change, so it was more the dressing. But they had it all organized, you know. They knew what was going on for each store for a switchover, so that wasn't so bad. But that was a bit of a tricky one. It was a bit tight, and the house, I mean, Mr.'s house, we chose not to keep it fairly minimal. And, you know, I know my house, even in that I grew up with, the furnishings from my parents did not change very much from when I was 7 to when I was 18 when I left the house, for instance. Now that's only, it's just basically 10 years. That's not that long, but essentially, in the rural South, if you're kind of not very, you're quite poor in the rural South, poor farmer, you're going to keep those things for the longest time. So the main pieces kind of stayed, and we changed the lighting. And of course, the house, when Celie moved into it, when we first saw it, wasn't Celie's house. And over time, you realize that she likes to sew. So she always had her sewing kit and her sewing machines. And so subtle things like there's way more layers and curtains, and there was nice tablecloths. And in the kitchen, there was like, what was open shelves ended up having little embroidered, little cloth curtains on strings, to cover the open shelves, and little small details like that. Larry worked into it. And of course, oil lamps became electrical, and the small subtle details changed, but it wasn't a big changeover. But we went back and forth a few times within our shoot, which was always a bit of a nuisance, but it is what it is. Actors availability and whatnot, and COVID hit us a couple times, so we had to like shoot out of order.
I've heard you mention before that you guys went as practical as you could, and obviously you were talking about a lot of location scouting early on with the location manager. So I was curious in terms of the ratio, I guess, to build to location. Were you on location a lot?
Yeah, on the Color Purple, I think let's see, the only sets we built were on stage, I should say, were obviously the interior ground floor and second floor of the house, and they were like one stage at the ground floor, when next to it was a second floor. There was obviously the staircase went up, and we had the upper hallway, but the actual rooms were repeated again on the stage on the stage floor next to us. We had the upper floor of the apartments of the general store, and we had the ground floor of the general store. We had the Art Deco grand set, the musical number where they come down the stairs and the orchestra's playing. We had that, and we had the gramophone, the giant gramophone, the 22-foot diameter record, and the big. We had practically built the stylus arm, and we had the little small jail cell, that sort of riveted iron jail cell based on reference of a couple of places I saw in Savannah, and the juke joint interior. I think that's that was really it for builds on stage. We had a lot of location builds. We had to build, obviously, the various iterations in the swamp. We had to actually disassemble things that were around that beautiful tree. There were some sets that belonged to the Underground Railroad, Amazon's Underground Railroad, that were these slave shacks were built with real brick chimneys. Like they're built kind of to stay put, they weren't built wild like film sets. They're built with real solid materials. So we had to employ some building movers to come and remove these 3 slave shacks from around that tree, because it was the nicest tree that I could find. And it kind of been, well, ruined from our point of view with having these slave shacks there. So that was a bit of an ordeal. We did build the whole gas station on location in Macon, Georgia. And we had a small set built into one of the theaters in Macon, Georgia, and we obviously shot outside. But other than that, there's certain things that were built that you wouldn't think that are built. For the dance number at the waterfall or below the waterfall, we start in a stone mason, like a stone mountain, which is like a quarry that they're banging the slaves. The prisoners the convicts are smashing up rocks for part of the dance, and then she appears below a waterfall where the washerwomen are scrubbing clothes. That was just meant to be a river, but I'd always say to my locations guys, if there's anything that's really interesting you see that it's not necessarily scripted that could work, just show anything interesting, because you never know. Or if it's something really interesting nearby somewhere where we're at for something else that it's not necessarily in the script, maybe we can incorporate it into something. So this is one time where we were looking at when we were looking for Mister's house, we were looking at this particular property above the dam, it was an old mill dam, and it didn't really suit us, but I was quite intrigued by the waterfall, and so I pitched it to Blitz. And originally the convicts were going to be marching across the top of the waterfall when the washerwomen were down below as part of the dance, but of course that required all the dancers to be stuntmen on the top. So that just blew that out of the budget. So we didn't. But in the end, the trick was, they were going to be just scrubbing and dancing down at the bottom. But of course, it was really rocky and there was no way I could make it smooth for them to dance. So we said, well, why don't we dance them in the water? But of course, easier said than done, because the waterfall was about 80 feet, 90 feet wide at the bottom, and about, I think it was 16, 18 feet in depth to the water, to the edge of the rocks. And it varied, but the water was like 7 feet deep, some places 3 feet deep, 2 feet deep, all over. And it was a regular shore. So we had to get underwater safety to come. Grips were in there underwater, putting together the scaffolding, steel decks underwater. And we had to pre-paint plywood to look like sort of weathered, smooth rock, and fit it in and scribe it all around the edge of the shore, so that they didn't, no dancer could step from, because they started on shore and step onto the water. They couldn't twist an ankle. It wasn't like we could just steer them on keep it square in there and just have them walk along little bridges. We had to like scribe it all in, and then just leave about a 2-foot gap right where the waterfall was, so the water could still go down underneath the scaffold. So it took about 3.5 days of grips and construction to build that, and we had to do it right before we were shooting, because the water level can change with rain quite quickly. So I mean, it's a simple idea, but it was actually tricky to execute. But I think it was very well worth it. And the nice thing was there wasn't so many shows that are so VFX heavy. This one was trying to be mostly in camera. I mean, obviously there's VFX that you wouldn't know about, painting out wires and painting out things that we couldn't deal with. We can only deal with the ground level of most things, and or maybe second floor signage and stuff. But they would have to paint out other modern things in the background of a few places. When we were doing Macon, Georgia, we could only dress so many storefronts and have so many cars, and there's some digital cars in the background, painting out some digital. I would say all these buildings are great, and I'd take pictures of other buildings and say, this building would be good to be superimposed over here, or this building would be superimposed over that gap where it's a modern building. And so we had a whole package together that would give the reference that I wanted and the signage that I wanted for each of those buildings, and they would put them in later. So that was kind of nice. And the night scene when we're pulling up to the movie theater marquee outside when they go into the movies, the street was mostly dressed, but of course there was a modern skyscraper in the background and a big neon sign up high that was painted out in a moon. Dan's light was there, and then they put a moon in instead. Things like that. And we shot some things where the leaves weren't quite there yet. Where we shot early in the spring. I think we shot quite early in the town, where when we were on the coastline, the trees had filled in a bit earlier, but when we were closer to Atlanta, there was a few exterior scenes that the leaves hadn't quite fully come in, so they had to add in things like that. And of course, I wanted to tie in the Spanish oak, the live oaks, the big oaks with moss that we see at the beginning. Of course, those are really coastal, and they don't really exist the way they do around Atlanta. So we were supposed to be a coastal town, so we peppered those in the background in a bunch of places. So these are kind of like that kind of VFX stuff that you don't really notice, but are there, just to help tie things together, because the landscapes and everything look quite different in the two areas. So we had to blend them a little bit with VFX. The house, that was a tricky one to find. It was a house that hadn't been lived in since about 1990. I think it was surrounded by chain link fence, and the grass was about 6 feet tall, like the big long grasses in the fields were about 6 feet tall. But it had this vista down a hill. It had a nice orientation, with the sun kind of behind it. The morning sun came nicely onto it, and it was really remote. Like, we found a lot of beautiful houses when we were looking for that house that were appropriate, maybe even more appropriate, but so many of them, are next to what was a tiny little country road became a highway, or there was too many neighbors nearby. We wanted this rural, really rural, remote kind of place. So what had happened was this whole, whoever family owned this old farm and property bequeathed it all to the county, and it became a park for the most part. The majority of it was a parkland, and then this chunk, however many acres, like 50 acres area, or 30 acres or something, was kind of left fallow, and the house was just sitting there. I wouldn't say rotting, because they'd put a modern roof on it, but at some point in the 80s or 90s, metal roof, and so we had to clad it. Well, luckily the siding was all nice, mostly aged. We actually blasted and aged it more and peeled off with whatever was loose, but the roof we covered over and put a second floor on. It had a very minor second floor, but we needed, in our script, we needed a second floor. So we built dormers front and back, and an extension, a kitchen extension with a stone chimney based on reference that we'd seen that a lot of these older houses had that this one didn't particularly have. And of course, the big trick of this one was, we needed a field of wildflowers, we needed acres of plants of indigo, and we needed like just a regular garden in the back of the house, on the side of the house. And so our greensman had a lot of work to do there, because we had to, we knew when we were going to shoot wasn't going to be long enough for tomatoes to be ready and things like that. So we had a lot of stuff grown in greenhouses in advance, kept in pots. Right. Then we, I think about 6 weeks out, we planted them in, and we put in a little underground sprinkler system to sprinkle them every now and then, because we couldn't, it rains a lot in Georgia, but early on you need to have regular water. The wildflowers were a bit scary because I knew what hillside I wanted to be covered in wildflowers. And I didn't realize wildflower seeds cost so much, but we bought $2,500 worth of wildflower seeds to do like maybe an acre or something, maybe 3/4 of an acre, something like that. I think it was only half an acre, whatever it was a fairly large bit of field. They tilled it all. It was just dirt for the longest time. And he planted it, and he said, no, it should. I kept saying, well, they're not there yet, or they're tiny little green sprouts. I'm like, we're only weeks away. I said, no, they should be there. They should be there. And then eventually, I think luckily our schedule changed. We got 1 extra week, and they came in just the right amount for the scene when they're walking through. So, of course, you got to pick the colors and all the rest. I didn't want to have it exactly all purple colored to be the house there, but that was important. And again, the greens, we had a really great greens team. A very experienced guy who's retiring, apparently soon after ours. So he had a lot of experience. We were really lucky to have him, and they were great. They did all the planting. It wasn't indigo, but we had to plant something that looked, because we didn't have time for indigo. It's about a year to grow. We did something similar, and it was just nice to deal with that level of, in advance, planting all these things and let them grow. And we basically bush hogged everything. All the huge grasses we took down to nothing. Again, it looked like, oh my God, hopefully that grows back, because it didn't look right at all. But eventually it was all timed so that when we were shooting there, it was going to be just fine. And it was, thankfully.
So the gas station, you have this important scene just outside of there, and but this was on the Main Street strip?
It was on the main boulevard in Macon, Georgia. And it was a kind of, Macon, the downtown of Macon was fairly, not abandoned, but it's not abandoned, but there's a lot of empty storefronts and everything, but there's still a lot of it had not been renovated and touched. So it was quite of a good base. The little piece that we had the interior of the theater in Macon, and we had the exterior of the theater in Macon on a different street. Actually, the interior was from one theater and the exterior was from another, because the interior was all renovated. The exterior we liked had the interior that was all renovated, and the interior we liked had the exterior that didn't look appropriate, or the street wasn't appropriate to us. So we used 2 locations. But there was a street in between, this pretty former grand boulevard that had trees down the middle, 2 roads on either side, and really nice buildings for the most part on both sides of the street. And even in the reverse, there was some mostly good buildings as well. It was a really grand intersection. At one time, it had seen better days. But what was nice was the importance of this scene. This is when Celie it's the first time she's come to this part of town, I guess other than the movie theater. The location was perfect because we were able to do it almost in the middle of the street. So you had people looking from all sides at this commotion that was happening when this Black woman was like standing up for herself in front of the white mayor's wife. And then, it was a horrible scene where she gets beaten and then sent to jail. But she wanted to be quite vulnerable and exposed there. So it was really nice I looked at a couple locations where, the gas station could be embedded in a block, in the middle of a block, but this was a way that we could stick it like literally in the middle of the block between the streets, very, very much out in the open. So when you're there and the camera can swing around, there's these white faces all around staring angrily at her. And, she's in a much bigger environment than we've seen yet in this movie, urban environment anyway. So it was quite a good location. So I'd looked at various references for gas stations, but I came across one just by fluke in Savannah. That was basically the architecture that I used here. And it just required a little modification to fit. I mean, there was some wings that I took off, and I just kept the simple central part, and it happened to fit in this little turnaround that was already there. It was already paved, cutting through the middle. So we kept that. It was really, really, really well positioned. It wasn't the ideal for lighting. Like we had to shoot at a certain time because a lot of it was very front lit, but we just we just scheduled it so we could shoot it during those times. So yeah, it was a pretty big build. I mean, it was a little build, but it was a pretty difficult build because it was full 360 build stuck in the middle of a street. And we had to do quite a lot of work to the streets and to the stores. Larry had a lot of work because they were mostly abandoned in that semi-abandoned, I guess, in that section, or inappropriate. Luckily, Macon was not, the downtown core is not, it's now gentrifying. So we had quite a lot of freedom there. We were, I don't remember how many weeks we were there, but I mean, I know it was at least, I think we were billing in there for 2 weeks at least, because we were shooting the 2 weeks on the coast at that time. And so I didn't get to see the beginning. I was away the whole time, and I just saw updates, and then I left the coast early, a couple days early before they moved to Macon. So I only got there a couple days beforehand, but I got updates regularly. I'd drawn that on SketchUp, and I got to, I don't know, in SketchUp you can use this AR version on your iPad where you can actually place it right in place. So it was really nice to stand there with Blitz and the Dan and just hold the iPad and walk around it, and you could see when the sun would be blocked by the overhang, and what we needed to, what it did, because there was a lot of stuff in the background we had to be careful to not see, so we knew what angles we could see. It was quite good. So by the time they got there, it was, they knew what they were getting, because we saw it virtually. We could stand in space with a little virtual set piece that we could walk around and look at, and we went there quite a few times to rehearse the scene. It was a pretty tough scene to shoot.
What was your biggest challenge? I guess what was also your biggest triumph, or maybe it was both?
The biggest challenge technically was figuring out how to do the juke joint. It was kind of one of my favorite sets in the end. It wasn't necessarily written the way we ended up doing it, but I think it got portrayed quite well, and it was visually a really nice and dynamic way to introduce Shug Avery and everything. But I think, strangely enough, some of the nicest things are just like that tree at the end. The very, very simple. As far as design goes, not a lot to it. It's just finding a beautiful tree. Sometimes those things, it's all about the location. So strangely enough, something simple as just a beautiful tree can be such an important set piece.
Thanks again for joining us, Paul. This has been so great to get a look into your process on the color purple. And thank you at home for listening to episode 3 of Fixed and Prep podcast, brought to you by the Canadian Production Design Association. See you soon.